going to move into this workshop now and just raise the question, is there a God? Well, the answer is yes. So now we just go to lunch early. Let's just write this down on your notepad. Yes. Okay. Here's what I'd like to do. I'd like to think of 3 contrary answers to that than yes. And use those. I introduced this a little bit our first time together, these sort of types of persons that we bump into, but now here we can go into a little bit more depth. And if all goes well and I time this right, we're asking you to submit questions for a Q&A panel, which will be up here after this session, but we might have some time for some interaction in this actual session as well. So be thinking about that if you'd like. But here are 3 contrary answers to is there a God? The first answer is no, there is not a God. And that answer would come from the secularist, the pure secularist, materialist, not materialist as, I'll date myself here. This is not Madonna, material girl, materialist. This is materialist, philosophical materialism. All there is matter. This is Carl Sagan. The cosmos was all there ever was, all there is, and all there ever will be. No God. Atheism, materialism, secularism. And in our day, in the 20th century, now into the 21st century, there are 2 versions of secularism, and one of them is statism. The state is God, and we saw this very, very blatantly in the 20th century and in communist state and in the Marxist state. But there's also a secularism within capitalism. So it's not just the statism of secularism. There's another version of that. But all the same, the answer is God is not. Then the answer to the question, is there a God? Yes, and he's many. This is the pluralist. We introduced this person last time. We're going to get into this a little bit more. So God is many. That's the pluralist. And then finally, we'll just briefly touch on this, and I'm certainly by no means an expert, but I at least want to sketch a few things for you. Is there a God? The answer is yes, and it is Allah. As I look out over the landscape and I think about the world that you are going to be entering into in this next generation, I really see these as the big 3 that you're going to have to be engaging. An encroaching secularism, an increasing pluralism, and Islam. Those are going to be the big 3 on the horizon that you'll be bumping into. When I was growing up back in the 70s and 80s, I don't think I had a single person living within any radius of me that was a Muslim. I don't remember interacting with Muslims in any way in my normal activities. I look at my own kids' lives and where they are in their employment or just in our neighborhood, and they're engaging Muslims all the time. They're around them. And I think this is a very different world than the world in which I grew up. And I think the world in which you are entering into is going to be a very different world. So let's think about these 3. Secularism, pluralism, Islam. God is not, God is many, God is Allah. I think they each need a unique response because they're coming from different places on the map. So let's deal first with the God is not. So now we're going to get into the so-called classical arguments for the existence of God. The argument that God is not is by and large from a philosophical standpoint or a scientific standpoint. Atheism is a relatively new kid on the block. It comes along with the modern world, and by new kid I mean over the millennia of human history. So it comes along with the modern world, and the idea is simply this. Ancient cultures needed mythology or religion to explain the phenomenon. We have science. In mythology, you got sick, or go to animism of underdeveloped cultures, you get sick. Why? Because you're being picked on and tormented by your dead ancestors, and you have not honored them in the way that you should. And so that's why you are sick. And they will literally close up the door of the hut and make a new door to try to trick the spirits so the spirits won't be able to come into the hut to afflict them. And if that doesn't work, let's tear down the hut and build a new one. And if that doesn't work, let's tear down the village and move down the river so that spirits won't be able to find us. In a religious scheme of things, understanding of things, we understand that God's sovereign hand is behind all things. It's a providence. And in God's providence, he brings things into our lives or doesn't bring things to our lives. But ultimately, when we bump into phenomenon that we can't explain or see, we answer with God. But in the modern world, we have science. And we know that people don't get sick or diseases because the spirits are inflicting their souls. They came into contact with a germ. They came into contact with a disease. It could be a genetic disease. What's explaining the phenomenon is science, right? Why does it rain? Mythology, it's the god of rain is sending down thunder, right? In religion, God causes the rain to fall on the just and the unjust, and it's a sign of his blessing and goodness. In the modern world, it's because of barometric pressure. A cold front moved in, it hit warm air, next thing you know, your soccer game gets rained out. The more science explains the phenomenon, the less we need God. And then God becomes an inconvenience because he actually expects things of us. Or God becomes difficult because why, after all, did God let Hitler kill 6 million Jews? And why, after all, did Idi Amin? And why, after all, did Papa Doc Duvalier? Why all these atrocities of the 20th century if there is a God? God is not only an inconvenience, he's a problem. And we don't need him. And that's secularism. That's atheism. So we push God out. So what do we do? Okay. Now we come into the philosophical arguments. And so we say, well, you know what the first thing you've got to realize is? Why is there something rather than nothing? The first thing you need to do is account for the world you live in. Where did it all come from? You can't just say it always was. You've got to have a beginning. We have something. Where did it come from? Well, you got to understand there was this matter and it got so compacted, this intense matter, and it just blew apart, and the next thing you know, we have a whole universe evolving out of that. Well, where did those particles of energy come from in the first place? Where did it come from? Why is there something rather than nothing? If there is no God, there's nothing. Why is there something rather than nothing? And so the philosophical arguments for God start with what we have. I'll read this to you. See if you can catch this. This is from Thomas Aquinas, medieval philosopher. He writes this: when an effect is better known to us than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause. So let me read that again. When an effect is better known to us than its cause, from the effect we proceed to the knowledge of the cause. So in a moment here, we are going to sit down and you're going to have a Chick-fil-A box lunch in front of you. That is an effect. It is something. The question is, why is there something rather than nothing? We should really be amazed that a Chick-fil-A box just appeared in front of us. We shouldn't be amazed if there was nothing in front of us. But there's something in front of us. And we got to pull this string off, Pharaoh, where it came from. Well, it came from you walking out and getting it. Well, no, it came from the store. Well, no, it actually came from the chicken, that poor defenseless little chicken running around. The effect has a cause. And we don't know the cause, but we know the effect. And we pull it's like a string, it's like a thread. And you just pull on a thread of that effect, and what does it do? It leads you back to the cause. All right? Aquinas goes on to say, if the effect exists, the cause must pre-exist. And hence, are you ready for this? The existence of God. the existence of God. The existence of God can be demonstrated by what we see in the effects. Paul says in Romans 1, what? It is plain to us. Take a look at it. It's Romans chapter 1. 3 places are very crucial for Paul here. One is Romans chapter 1, verse 19. For what can be known about God is plain to them because God has shown it to them. How's he shown it to them? His invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. And the things that have been made are the effect. And they are a plain, clear, evident testimony to the cause, and the cause is God. So that's one. Hold that. Go over to Acts chapter 14. Here's Paul and Barnabas at Lystra. I alluded to this earlier. They think Paul's Hermes and Barnabas is Zeus because Paul's doing all the talking. And we get then to the speech, verse 15 of Acts chapter 14. Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. Past generations he allowed nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness, without testimony, without evidence. And that testimony and evidence is, the end of verse 17, he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. Now, we could go off on this for quite a while. Not only is the creation an effect that provides utility, so it provides food, it actually speaks to your inner desires of joy and satisfaction and gladness. It captures who you are. Here's one of the problems with the secularist and the scientism, not science, scientism, and the atheist worldview. It reduces you to molecules and matter and atoms. And it does no justice to the fullness of you as a human being that has joy and suffering and sorrow and pain and delight and pleasure. It makes everything about matter and atoms and is very reductionistic. Well, not only is the creation a counter to the fact that God made everything, but the fact that we can be glad. And we can pull on this a little bit. The fact that we pursue things, that we desire things, and the pursuit of those things can bring us pleasure and gladness and joy. How do you account for that in purely materialistic terms? So Acts chapter 14, we've got Romans 1, we've got Acts chapter 14, we've got Acts chapter 17. Paul says the same thing. Here he comes to Athens. You are very religious people. You have your altar to an unknown God. Verse 23 of Acts chapter 17, I'm coming to proclaim this God to you. And what does he first say? Verse 24, the God who made the world and everything in it. He starts with the effect. When the effect is more known to you than the cause, you start with the effect and you work your way back to the cause. And the effect is the world. Now, philosophers call this the cosmological argument for the existence of God. Cosmological, one word, cosmological argument for the existence of God. It's built around this idea of cause and effect. Right? Chick-fil-A lunches don't just poof and appear. They have causes. The world just doesn't poof. It has a cause. So the cause, the effect rather, is the cosmos, the world. Therefore, it must have a cause. Now, are you ready for this? Have you had some coffee? You're too young. Some of you are too young to drink coffee. Are you awake? Are you ready for this? Here's the big debate here, or the big pushback to this. You're going to get coffee. That's a good move. The big pushback to this is, well, who caused God? If every effect has cause, and there must be a beginning, Well, where did God come from, and who caused God? Right? Now, here's the answer. It's from Aristotle. It's called the Law of Infinite Regress. Now, here's where it gets fun. If Aristotle can be fun, here's where it gets fun. The Law of Infinite Regress. Picture with me a domino chain. Can you see it? You got a table full of dominoes, and you see the dominoes falling. So this is cause and effect, right? The domino falls because it's hit by another domino. It's hit by a domino, 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 domino. Now, what do you see? You see present motion, or you see present causality, cause and effect. You see the domino chain in front of you. Now, what does that mean? What you see in front of you means it goes back. Now, to say, well, who caused God, is to say that this domino chain goes back. The fancy word for goes back is regress. It regresses into infinity, right? Just keeps going and going and going and going and going. So the law of infinite regress is the idea that this causal chain just keeps going back into infinity. But here's the response to that. If it goes back into infinity, make sure I see you guys behind the beam over there, it never started. Just think this through. If it's going back, if it has an infinite past, it never started. But how do we know it started? Because we have the evidence of it in front of us. Therefore, it must have a beginning. That's not Paul. That's not Romans 1. That's Aristotle. Law of infinite regress. There must be a first cause. Now, what Paul, Aquinas, reformers, people at Princeton, people like R.C. Sproul, they connect the dots from that first cause to God. But the argument's Aristotle. His argument's very simple. We see motion in the universe. We see cause and effect in the universe. Therefore, it must have a beginning. There must be, as Aristotle called it, an unmoved mover and an uncaused cause, or we would simply say a first cause. So you see what we're trying to say here? We have evidence, you have to give an account for it. And so there must be a beginning. And now here's one other piece. It's kind of interesting, right? That beginning has to be not identical with the effects. Go back to Acts chapter 14, verse 15 of Acts chapter 14. Men, Paul's crying out, stop calling me Hermes and stop calling him Zeus. We also are men of like nature with you. And we bring you good news. There's someone who is unlike our nature. And this someone is God. There is someone who is outside of this causal chain of being. Now, Aquinas, our good friend from the 1200s, is going to make the distinction between what he calls a necessary being and a contingent being. Contingent beings need other beings to exist. In other words, you need your parents, and they needed their parents, and so on, and so on, and so on, and so on. That's a contingent being. A necessary being does not need other being to be. They exist in themselves. And in the beginning, God. Now, how is it that a philosopher like Aristotle is understanding the nature of the universe that accords with the way it is presented in Genesis 1, Romans 1, Acts 14, and Acts chapter 17? Because this is the world God made, and this world is a testimony to his existence. And in addition to what we call the cosmological argument, we also sometimes use what we call the teleological argument. T-E-L-E-O, logical, one word, teleological. And this is from a Greek word, telos, which means purpose or design. And the idea is that the world not only exists, It has incredible design. And so the design of the universe does not just simply reflect some first cause in some basic sense, but an intelligent being that has created a world with intense design and beings with design. And so we have today the so-called intelligent design movement. I'm sure many of you are familiar with these folks, who look at the design on a macro level of the universe, of how it holds together, and look at the amazing micro level of the universe. When Darwin was formulating his theory, the cell was a black box. We knew it existed, but didn't know anything about it. And Darwin has a fundamental principle of the simple cell. So more complex organisms are the arrangements of those simple cells, but this notion of a simple cell, well, now the cell is no longer a black box. We can look right into it, and what do we see? Irreducibly complex system within that single cell. There is no such thing as a simple cell. Unbelievable design on a micro level. How do you account for it? Design on a macro level. How do you account for it? The idea here is very simple. We have the effect, and when the effect is known to us, you pull on the thread to get to the unknown. And here's the rub, and we don't have time to get into this, but I'll just mention this. The idea of existence, your existence, the existence of reality, the idea of meaning and purpose, that you have a desire to live for something, and even the desire of morality, and going one step further, the universality of morality. How do you account for this on purely evolutionary, materialistic terms? That's the question. The question to the one who says, I don't believe there is a God. Well, how do you account for the origin of the universe and the existence of the universe? How do you account for the idea of meaning and purpose and design in the universe? And how do you account for morality in the universe? Questions to prod and push and find few weak spots of the view that there is no God. So the first answer to the question, is there a God, is no. The secularist, the atheist, the pure materialist. And we respond with the philosophical arguments. We respond with asking questions. We respond with saying, well, how do you account for these things? The second person to this question, is there a God, is the pluralist who says, well, no, God is many. God is many. And so the idea is simply this. There's some sort of abstract idea of God. And then you have the Christian God, and you have Judaism and Yahweh, and you have Allah, and you can even go over to the Eastern religions, and you have Hindu and the Ein Sof. And so you have what here? Various religious expressions, and they're all saying the same thing. And behind that curtain is this being. And so you have the Christian, and they read the Christian Bible, and they talk about the Christian God. And you have the Muslim, and they read the Quran, and they talk about Allah. And you have the Jew, and they read the Tanakh, and they know Yahweh. And you have the Hindu, and they read the Upanishads, and they have this view. And they all have the same view of the same thing. How do you respond to pluralism? Well, here's a very quick response. We have the law of non-contradiction, right? A cannot be non-A at the same time. You can't be in this room and out of this room at the same time. It can't be raining and not raining at the same time. The law of non-contradiction. Scratch beneath the surface. These world religions are not complementary. They're not compatible. They are contradictory. Think about this, because to push pluralism, you have to push it all the way. Think about this. Fundamentally, in Eastern religions, the conception that they're after is not even redemption. It's some sort of enlightenment to true being. Now go to the Western religions. Islam, Christianity, Judaism, they're after redemption. But we have a fundamental, not difference, not reconcilable difference between Eastern and Western religion. We have a flat-out contradiction of what salvation even is from East to West. And the Christian God is not compatible with Yahweh of Judaism. The Christian God is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. And the Christian God is not compatible with Allah. We're not versions of the same thing. And so, can you have A and non-A at the same time? This is the law of non-contradiction. It begins to break down. The only way pluralism works is if you just keep out there on the surface, and even if you keep out there on the surface, it doesn't work. And here's what the pluralist wants to do. The pluralist wants to say, well, we respect all religions. Well, no, you don't. Because you're saying Christianity really isn't true. Because it says the God is the triune God who made all things. And Christianity says God is not Allah. So you're not actually respecting religions, you're disrespecting religions by saying to religions, don't take your beliefs too seriously. Because the moment you start taking your beliefs too seriously, you're going to find out everybody is not saying the same thing. We're saying rather contrary and contradictory things. So be aware of surfacey arguments from the pluralist. And be aware of this card that's played, that this is respectful to religions by honoring all of them. Actually, it's not. Because what you're saying to all these religions is you have to suspend your beliefs and your doctrines. And you have to take the view that they don't matter. They're not compatible, they're contradictory. The pluralist, the view that God is many. And in response to that, we make a case that there is only one true God. You know, we see this from the beginning. We see this as God is bringing Israel out of Egypt, and we see the plagues. And it's very interesting. Trace it out. Find out what Moses' father-in-law says when he hears about how Israel was redeemed out of Egypt. He says, now I know that the Lord alone is God. The Bible comes to us in a pluralistic context. Pluralism is not something new of the 21st century. The first century Greco-Roman culture was pluralist. And what do we have in there? We have the gospel that declares there is only one God, and there is only one way, and there is salvation in no other. Pluralism is not new. It was there in the ancient Near Eastern world of the Old Testament. It was there in the Greco-Roman world of the New, the pluralist. We come then to God is Allah. The answer to the question, is there a God? Yes, and it is Allah. Again, I'm no expert on Islam. I will tread very lightly and just basically here with you. But we can do a comparison between Allah and the God of Christianity. And here are some things to note. The God of Islam is a very impersonal God. A very impersonal God. The God of Christianity is a very intimate God who is involved intimately in the lives of his people, who reveals himself to us as our Father. Think of the great story of Hagar. And here she is, an Egyptian, a slave, a woman. In that cultural context, we are saying she's at the bottom of the pole here. And she's in the middle of the desert, and she's in a desperate condition. And what does God do but give her a well? And he reaches out to her, and there's this beautiful moment where she recognizes this well needs a name. Ber Lahoi Roy. The God who sees. And here is this infinite God of the universe who looks down on this very insignificant person in this place and time. And he not only sees her, he cares for her. The biblical narrative is full of a God who is intimately involved in his creation and in his people. A God who cares and loves and is a father. In Islam, God is sovereign in a capricious and arbitrary way. In Scripture and the Christian God, God's sovereignty is presented within a context of his goodness and wisdom. Remember Moses when he's pleading for the people and they did the golden calf thing and God's ready to wipe them out, and Moses says, wait, for the sake of your reputation, don't wipe out your people. And God pulls back his hand of judgment, and then Moses is like, well, I got that. I'm going to push for one more. Show me your glory. And God says, all right. And he puts Moses in the cleft of the rock, and he says, I will pass all my goodness by you. And when he does, this is what God says, I am Jehovah, and I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will harden whom I harden. That's his sovereignty. And he is sovereign over his creatures. And the potter never hears from the clay, why did you make me like this? But notice what he says, I will pass all my goodness by you. And in the context of God as the omnibenevolent God, he declares his sovereignty over his creatures to have mercy on whom he will have mercy and harden whom he will harden. God is not presented as a sovereign God in a capricious and arbitrary manner. He is presented as the all-knowing, all-wise, all-good God who is judge, ruler, sovereign king of the universe. And that is different from the presentation of Allah in Islam. Finally, God has no son in Islam. Do you know what the most popular title for Jesus is in the Quran? Does anybody know? Jesus, son of Mary. It occurs over and over and over and over and over and over again. Jesus, son of Mary, Jesus, son of Mary, Jesus, son of Mary. It's the humanness of Jesus. The humanness of Jesus. God has no son in Islam. And the Christian God is God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Spirit. Is there a God? Yes. He is the creator God who made all things. He is the only true God. And he is the God who revealed his glory in the Logos. Read the prologue of John 1. There's a great word there in John chapter 1. I love this word. Go to John chapter 1, verse 18. The end of the prologue. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. Now, the Greek word there is literally the Greek word exegete. Did you ever hear this expression, exegete or exegesis? Have you ever heard this term? What you're doing when exegesis is, you're interpreting the text. The word literally means to lead out of. Exit, ago, to lead out of. And when you exegete a text, you lead the meaning out of the text for the hearer. So a good preacher, solid preaching, is in the text and brings the text to life and brings the meaning out of the text and puts it right on display for you. That's exegeting the text. Jesus exegetes the Father. He leads the meaning of the Father out for us to see. And right before our very eyes, we see who God is. We know that there is a God from the effects that can be demonstrated that there is a God. Rationally, reasonably demonstrated that there is a creator God from the effects. And we ultimately know the creator, redeemer God in the revelation of his Son, who came to make his glory known in Jesus Christ. So the answer to, is there a God, is a resounding yes. And we need to be aware of the no's and the type of no's that come to that question. And we need to study this book and study this world study the philosophers, so that we can be able to say, here is the demonstration why there is a God, so that people can look to the book that this God gave us and learn about the Son. So, is there a God? Yes. We stopped where we started. Well, I have 3 minutes by my count for questions, so I'm happy to take any you might have at this point. I will repeat it. So the question is, so we talk about the law of non-contradiction. Very crucial to Christianity is the mystery of the Trinity, 3 in 1, 1 in 3. How do we present that in a way that does not look like a logical contradiction, or how do we respond to the charge that our Trinitarian belief is a logical contradiction rather, and violates the law of non-contradiction? The answer to that is, in short, that while God is a God of logic, there is also transcendent of logic. So our minds have difficulty comprehending the 1 and 3, the 3 and 1. Does not mean that it is illogical, rather transcendent of logic. That's one way to sort of get at it. The other way to get at it is related to that, is to say we should expect mystery in understanding the Godhead. So if we're talking about an infinite God who is infinite above a finite creature and a finite creation, we should expect mystery. If we don't bump into mystery, then this is likely not a conception of God worth believing. So the fact that we find mystery should not undermine the God of mystery. It should actually serve to prove it, serve to demonstrate it. If we bump into something that we fully comprehend, we're not dealing with a being that is outside of this causal chain and beyond us. I think this is the best way we can respond to that. It's a great question, though, so thank you.